Good afternoon. My name is Angela Ponmaka, and I'm the designated federal officer for the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome to all of our virtual attendees. Today begins the second day of the two-day meeting to consider the Commission's final report to Congress and the President. This meeting is being live streamed to allow members of the public to attend this virtual meeting and is also being recorded and will be posted on our website. As we begin our live stream plenary meeting, allow me to share a few procedural remarks. This commission is an independent presidential advisory committee operating under the Federal Advisory Committee Act and the Government in the Sunshine Act. Today's meeting was announced in a Federal Register notice on Friday, January 8th, 2021. As mentioned yesterday, there's one change to the meeting's agenda as posted on the Commission's website. The Commission today will address Chapter 6 of the draft final report today, and the Commission covered Chapter 9 yesterday. Otherwise, there are no other changes to the agenda. Depending on time constraints, there may be an opportunity for members of the public to provide written comments or questions to the Commission today. For those joining us via the live stream on YouTube, you can provide comments or questions via our YouTube live meeting comment section and via Twitter by tweeting or messaging @AI Commission. With that, I say welcome and I call this meeting to order. I now turn it over to the Commission's Executive Director, Illy Bayrakhtari, for opening remarks.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Illy Bayrakhtari, and I serve as the Executive Director to the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. It is my pleasure to welcome commissioners as well as members of the general public to the second day of our two-day plenary meeting to review and discuss the draft final report. To members of the general public and media, on behalf of NSCAI commissioners and the staff, I would like to thank you for your interest in the work of the Commission and for your participation in today's plenary meeting via our live stream. As mentioned by the designated federal officer, those tuning in today can provide comments or questions today via YouTube comment function or Twitter. To NSCAI commissioners, the purpose of this second day of our virtual public plenary meeting is to continue our review and deliberation of the Commission's draft final report and recommendations to Congress and the executive branch. This document is based on your guidance, feedback, and endless hours of review. As we did yesterday, an NSCAI commissioner will deliver introductory remarks on each of the final report's 16 chapters and present the set of recommendations for deliberation. The NSCAI professional staff will assist in guiding the discussion as needed. For those that missed day one, the purpose of this day two meeting is for commissioners to present, review, and deliberate on the recommendations included in the materials we posted online on our website. This day two meeting will result in the finding of agreement on the draft final report chapters and recommendations, and then Commission staff will work to finalize the report and recommendations. A meeting to officially approve the final report and its recommendations will occur on March 1st. With that, I would like to ask Dr. Eric Schmidt and Mr. Bob Work if they would like to deliver any opening remarks. And then I would like to start where we left off yesterday with Chapter 6 to be introduced by Commissioners Dr. Josemarie Griffiths. Eric, over to you.
So as we discussed yesterday, we're very happy to be doing this meeting for the public and for ourselves. And I want to welcome everyone back. For those of you who did not participate yesterday, this is a FACA-compliant meeting where you're watching our deliberations around a report that's super important. So with that, why don't we get started? Bob, do you have any comments?
Sorry. No, I have no comments, Eric. I'm anxious to listen to the discussion.
Thank you. And with that, I'll turn over to Dr. Josemarie Griffiths.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, both to my fellow commissioners and to those of you watching online. Through our many conversations with experts from the government, academia, and private sector over the last 2 years, one of the most consistent themes has been the government's pressing need for a workforce that's prepared to buy, build, and use today's digital technology. If government agencies do not have enough of the right talent, every AI initiative will struggle and most will fail. Unfortunately, as we've said before, creating a government workforce that's prepared to buy, build, and use today's digital technologies is an amazing challenge, an immense challenge. Today's workforce initiatives are helpful, but insufficient to meet the government's needs. Incremental changes or staying the course will simply not be enough. Bolder, more aggressive actions are necessary. Ms. Clyburn, Dr. Mark, Secretary Walk, and I believe the recommendations in Chapter 6, bold as they may be, will substantially reduce the government's technical talent deficit. Chapter 6 is structured around the argument that to expand and improve its digital and AI workforce, the government needs to first organize digital talent within the government through a talent management system designed to house highly skilled specialists. Where talent is located in an organization is as important as the quality of the talent. Second, the government needs to recruit digital talent that already has the skills the government needs, such as industry experts, academics, and recent college graduates. Third, the government needs to build its own workforce by training and educating current government employees. And fourth, it needs to employ its digital workforce more effectively to ensure digital talent can perform meaningful work once they're in government. Each of these topics has associated recommendations, and I will highlight 4. Under Organize, government agencies should establish digital corps that recruit, train, educate, and manage their digital workforce. Today's talent management frameworks are poorly designed for the digital workforce, which needs career-long paths for technical expertise alongside management pathways. For other similarly technical fields, such as medicine, the government has established such a corps. We recommend replicating this model for parts of the digital workforce. Under Recruit, the government should create well-organized opportunities for civilian digital experts to serve part-time in government by establishing a National Reserve Digital Corps. Members of the NRDC would work at least 38 days a year as advisors, instructors, or developers across the government. Under Build, the United States needs to establish a new government civilian academy, a civilian service academy, to train future civil servants. The United States Digital Service Academy would be an independent agency and degree-granting university whose graduates would serve 5-year commitments across the federal government as government civilians. Starting a new service academy is a bold step, but one we believe can serve as a major component of the government's long-term solution to technical talent. Nothing like it exists today to act as an engine for change and to produce a government civilian workforce that's aligned to the whole of government's departments and agencies' workforce needs. Under Employ, the government needs to establish a suite of digital career fields for both civilian and military personnel, including software development, data science, and artificial intelligence. Digitally talented people should be able to reasonably expect to spend a career performing meaningful work focused on their field of expertise in government. So thank you, and I look forward to our conversation about these recommendations and the rest of Chapter 6. And I open the floor to my fellow commissioners.
I just wanted to underscore that part of educating an AI-ready workforce, it's not just about skills training. It's also about accountability and some of the things we were talking about yesterday. So there's a tie-in between this issues that we were discussing yesterday.
I'd like to ask if, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, I'll follow.
Thank you. I think inside of my head, I kind of connect the fact that we have to have a changing workforce, and that reskilling people and having the ability to tap into the broader workforce that doesn't have access necessarily to all the different universities, colleges, local. I think that giving a new pathway to bring technology and technicians to this field is important. I think, and I understand from the reading, that is exactly what we're trying to promote, correct?
Correct, absolutely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
Eric?
So on the university, I'm interested in what the team's conception of the university is. Is this primarily a university that will be done by existing universities in the private sector? How will it actually work? Or how do you conceive it?
And if my fellow commissioners want to jump in, otherwise I'll. Okay. Well, I think we, first of all, we see that it's an important part of the future to actually bring a group of people together, develop a common set of ideas and shared experiences, and believe that they're actually going to have careers in government. That's the first piece. I think implementation issues are going to be challenging, if I'm to be honest, but because it's a bold step. And I think it could be both a combination of creating an entity as a standalone entity, but I honestly believe in this current academic workforce development climate, it's going to have to involve collaborations with other institutions. But that's my opinion. Please, other members of the LOE3 should comment on this as well.
And Mr. Chairman, one of the reasons why I am so committed to this chapter and to, in essence, answering the question that you posed is a recognition that the current or existing pathways when it comes to educational development and enhancement, respectfully, as great as they have fallen short in terms of meeting the mark. And so the boldness you see here with a very intentional approach and a different construct when it comes to educating and onboarding those who may not be able to afford traditional pathways. That's why it's so important. The talent is here. It is just not cultivated. And so how do we put systems in place to ensure that bottleneck is addressed? And this bold approach in terms of a separate, a standalone, but not alone in its mission or its purpose. That's why we were bold enough to put this forth as a recommendation.
I'm not sure I'm going to 100% agree with what of all of Mignon's points. I think I agree that there's quite a bit of talent there and we need to best utilize it. But I think additionally, there is a challenge that we need to bring in additional talent. And to underscore one of the comments that Jose Marie made is that this is not to supplant, the traditional university education pathway. We need a widespread front of increasing, more within the USG agencies, in addition to the universities. And I really want to emphasize what Jose Marie said, which is the other side benefit that you get is you establish this community of people who are interested in AI within the USG. And that community of practice will reap many, many benefits.
I just want to add that nothing you said, I hope, is not contradictory. It's not contrary to what I was saying. I was just recognizing where some of the deficiencies are. I am in South Carolina, and some of the traditional pathways are not capturing the talented that is out there because of affordability and other issues. And so, that's the primary point. If I was inartful in articulating it, that was not meant to be. I just say an all of the above approach is one in which we should consider.
I think go ahead, Gilman.
I was just going to say that, we have models that we applied in the past to other fields that shows that this does work. A good example is the National Intelligence University. It's a degree-giving university. You have to be a member of the IC Armed Services to attend. It does two things, these kinds of universities. One is it attracts talent, but also develops the talent you already have. I think that's going to be critical for us to be successful. It's just not individuals entering into the digital workforce, but transformative. How do you take skilled executives and workers, particularly within the USG, and provide them the necessary talents and perhaps even degrees necessary for them to be skilled up to perform the task at hand?
So as a former computer science educator for higher education, I strongly resonate with Commissioner Clyburn's and Commissioner Griffith's main points here. I would encourage this as an opportunity to rethink these kinds of pieces of education, and actually not to just do a copy or ask for primary guidance from the existing structures. There are plenty of very experienced and wise computer science and IT educators out there who would relish the chance to rebuild how we actually run these kind of education establishments without the constraints of all the traditional and actually very inefficient and overpriced aspects of traditional university education.
It would seem to me that industry should play a partner role in this construct. That industry could bring their wants and needs and integrate into this concept. I think that virtual training is starting to grab hold, which obviously will give access to a broader community, as Mignon talked about. And I think that we ought to really take a look perhaps in the implementation plan about how we can form that industry partnership in creating this edifice.
I'd like to agree with Katrina on that. I think that we could imagine thinking through a process by which we bring industry to the table to think through what corporations could actually contribute to these kinds of programs, maybe through some sort of a working group, or a combination group, government and industry and educators and academia, to think through the opportunities there. You can even imagine getting competitive spirit going among industry as to who might support and provide resources of various kinds, whether it be code, education, methods, people.
And Eric, back to your original question, the Digital Service Academy, I mean, the group discussed this, and the Digital Service Academy was viewed as a pathway for people who know they want to become a civil servant and have a government career. So, these would be people who would be coming in with some type of a payback period, say 6 years or something like that. We haven't gotten down to the nitty gritty yet. And so it would be a standalone academy, and like Gilman said, really with the Defense Intelligence University kind of as one model. But then there's the National Reserve Digital Corps, which is based upon the NROTC model and National Guard model. And those would be folks who would go to any university in the United States in an approved STEM occupational field or discipline. And when they came out, they would only serve a certain number of days each year. And they could work for Google, or they could work for Microsoft or Oracle or any other civilian side. So it's designed to attract people who want different things, people who want to serve their country but don't want to have a full-time government career over time, and then those who do. So it's very much kind of patterned on the way we attract talent now in our officer corps.
I think my general comment is I would try to make your proposals as specific as possible. So in other words, if there's going to be a new university, try to describe it more clearly, because by the time we go from our recommendation to legislation, it might get changed in a way we don't like. So try to be as specific as to what we're recommending as we can.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to ask Justin on the staff here if he has any thoughts, because he has done a lot of research and a lot of thoughts was put into this recommendation. So Justin, if you're online, if you want to add anything, it's fine if you don't, but turn it over to you.
Very much in line with what Mr. Work and Dr. Griffiths and Ms. Clyburn said already. What we tried to do is explore three broad categories of ways to bring people into government. One was the idea of improving the hiring process to bring people who have an existing skill set in more quickly, to build off of existing programs at universities, like Mr. Work was just mentioning, through expanding existing scholarship for service programs and also adding an AI scholarship for service program that's more focused on the goals of the commission. And then we looked at the throughput of those programs right now and believe that in the near medium term, and especially in the long term, though, there's a lot of benefit to having a government-specific institution, like Dr. Griffiths was saying, that can help shape the government's culture around technology by producing a large number of graduates in high-quality education. So it's, to answer your original question, Dr. Schmidt, it's really a combination of both, by building off of the existing institutions and then creating a government institution as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Dr. Griffiths, over to you.
Okay.
If you have any questions.
Are there any more questions, comments? Well, just to summarize then, I think perhaps what we've put together is sort of an all-hands effort to try and create multiple pathways to both nurture and attract and educate and train digital talent to be able to go into the government, but have a variety of options for people. So it's not one pathway, there's not only one pathway into government AI areas, that there are multiples, and that's what we've tried to do in a fairly comprehensive way. And we do believe that just actually moving forward with existing programs, it's just not going to move the talent pool fast enough to be able to achieve what the government needs to achieve. So I thank you for your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Griffiths. I would also just like to point out that we've had numerous engagements with Hill, and they're really interested in the people aspect of how we get this faster and how do we build domestic talent pools. So I know there's a lot of energy on the Hill. I know Dr. Schmidt has engaged Hill, and I know each of you individually has engaged many members of Congress. So we will continue to do that, and I think they'll be really interested in this set of recommendations for our final report. So we will keep you posted on that. And obviously we will take the conversation from today and then update the materials for you to review again in March. I'd like to turn now over to remaining part 2 chapters of our final report. As I noted yesterday, the part 2 is called Winning the Technology Competition. It consists of 8 chapters. We discussed the first one yesterday, and we have 7 more to go. They all situate AI in a broader national security context. They call out for the need to develop a national technology strategy that ensures that our country has the right mix of policies that promote AI talent and innovation, preserve our hardware advantages, and protect American intellectual property and the integrity of our open research environment from adversaries. So we have 7 chapters as part of this part 2 report from our final document. Again, I'll turn it over to Dr. Griffiths, since chapter 10 discusses the talent competition. Over to you, Dr. Griffiths, and for 5 minutes of opening remarks, followed by a conversation with other commissioners.
Thank you very much. Well, in case people have just joined, I want to welcome everyone this afternoon who are watching our plenary session online. We believe that the United States is in a global competition for scarce AI and STEM talent. Cultivating more potential talent at home and recruiting and retaining more existing talent from foreign countries are the only 2 options to sustain the US lead. Dr. Mark, Secretary Work, Ms. Clyburn, and I have developed 2 sets of recommendations that address both domestic and international talent. The current model of STEM education in America will not meet the challenges of tomorrow. To ensure that we continue to lead the world in artificial intelligence, we need to help students pursue graduate education in STEM fields and create incentives for professors and potential professors to remain in academia, where they can educate the next generation of AI experts. We must also address the inequality that plagues the K-12 system. Imbalances in access to quality teachers, facilities, and resources, in addition to societal norms that dissuade particular demographics from pursuing STEM and AI, are leading many students to walk away from STEM at an early age. The result is that an insufficient number of students have neither desire nor the ability to further pursue an education in STEM. Therefore, we are asking Congress to pass a new National Defense Education Act to bolster STEM education in America. The Commission believes the time is right for a second NDEA, one that mirrors the first legislation, but with important distinctions. The NDEA 2 would focus on funding students acquiring digital skills like mathematics, computer science, information science, data science, and statistics. It should also fund scholarships for undergraduates, fellowships for graduate students, and postdoctoral positions. If the United States does not invest in domestic digital talent, the shortage of qualified practitioners for digital roles will continue to grow, hamstringing our economy, scientific progress, and ultimately our national power. While STEM education reform is incredibly important, it alone will not be sufficient to meet the United States' needs for digital talent. And for that, we need to turn to one of our traditional sources of strength, immigration. The United States' present status as a global power comes in part from serving as a magnet for many of the world's brightest minds. Immigrants have long played an outsized role in the United States as inventors, scientists, and entrepreneurs. As stated in the report, however, the United States is in a global competition for scarce artificial intelligence and STEM talent, and for the first time in our lifetimes, we're in danger of losing this competition. To ensure that we continue to serve as a beacon for the world's talent, the government needs to move quickly to enact a combination of executive and legislative branch actions. The legislative branch actions should revolve around the passage of a National Security Immigration Act that would help attract and retain skilled workers, immigrants, and entrepreneurs. Such an act would grant green cards to students graduating with STEM PhDs from accredited American universities, double the number of employment-based green cards, create an entrepreneur visa, and create an emerging and disruptive technology visa. I should also mention that we are very aware of concerns about technology transfer. Our immigration recommendations were developed in coordination with our technology protection recommendations that my colleagues will address in more detail in Chapter 14. Together, we believe the recommendations will help advance American science and technology. And I'd now like to open the floor for discussion.
I would just like to emphasize that really the structure of the recommendations is kind of dual track. One is homegrown, track one is homegrown, and then track two is more relating to immigration. And I just wanted to bring up whether we should consider even more strongly emphasizing the role of undergraduate and graduate fellowships directly in the area of AI, since, you know, after all, we are the National Security Commission on AI, not STEM. Although obviously STEM is very important to AI.
Exactly. Comments, anyone?
Agree with Steve's last point. This is Ken.
Thank you, Ken. I believe that we did at one point have numbers in there, so perhaps we can strengthen the recommendation. My recall is that it was 25,000 undergraduate scholarships, 5,000 graduate scholarships, and 700 postdoc positions to be funded. That's my recollection of what we had.
Yes,
Yeah.
And it was brought to my attention that the NDAA 2 proposal does have that kind of support. I'm just wondering if we need to bring that more to the forefront of the report.
Mm-hmm. Do that.
I think this whole AI challenge in terms of the technology space, getting the education and technical skill, goes from beyond high school up to undergraduate and graduate. The technical skills and the graduation of access to meaningful work isn't just being held to an undergraduate degree. That really, when we're looking at artificial intelligence, there are rudimentary forms of that technology that people could get the equivalent of a more grade scale type ability to perform meaningful tasks. And I don't think we missed that in the document. I think we might be highlighting just the graduate and undergraduate, but I think as a team here, we should recognize that to get more workers into this field, we need to address a broader community, and that is in that section. And the other point I'd like to highlight, as I think brought out just recently here in this conversation, these chapters interrelate. They have to be connected. We talk about technology transfer. We talk about making sure we vetted people who will work in these fields, particularly those associated with national security. We've talked about how to protect intellectual property. All of these fields relate, goes from the beginning to end. And I think it's important that somehow we bring that out, yes, but also have people who are listening and watching and reading see that connectivity. You can't isolate one chapter from the other. They have to be done in a marriage.
Yes, I think, Katerina, it was very early on when we, after we'd gone and had some various discussions in our lines of inquiry, when we came back, it seemed that every group said there's an element of workforce development that's very important to this particular area of conversation. And so I think what we try to do is bring it all together. To your first point about it's not just undergraduate and graduate degrees. Some of our earlier recommendations addressed that, and we recommended changes to the way the government hires individuals and the way it assesses individuals coming into the workforce to allow for the brilliant young people who may just have been graduated from high school, but who've been doing very, very interesting AI-related entrepreneurial work, to allow them to bring in portfolios of evidence and actually be hired at that level. But I also think there is a role for the community and technical colleges in this country as well, not just the undergraduate, the baccalaureate universities. And I think you may or might not know, but there's an increasing set of articulations between the career technical education folks, the workplace, and higher education in the universities. So as I say, it's sort of an all-out attack on this to try and say how many different ways can we get people to understand there are significant opportunities for them and to have them have the confidence to move forward and leverage them. I can't underplay the important role of undergraduate and graduate degrees as well. So they're all important.
Thank you, Dr. Griffiths. I'll just ask if Justin or Tess have any comments to add, since they were both supporting this effort from the staff perspective.
I'm good on my front anyway. Thank you.
Thanks, Justin. Tess, anything from you? I know you had some.
Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Over to you, Dr. Griffiths, for any last comments before we jump to the next chapter.
I think it's sort of self-explanatory. This is important, and we've been working to try and put in some bold ideas, and we appreciate the conversation, and we take your comments under advisement, and we'll work on revising the final version. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Griffiths. And then we will be turning on to chapter 11, called Accelerating AI Innovation, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Andrew Moore to lead the conversation for the next 5 minutes.
You're muted, Andrew.
Andrew, you're still muted.
I apologize for my ineptness with using the video conferencing software. Great to see everyone. My name is Andrew Moore. I am part of the line of effort that's looking into artificial intelligence research and development. My fellow commissioners are Eric Horvitz, Bill Mark, Ken Ford, and Steve Chen, and we've been aided by a superb staff within the commission. The overarching objective of our work has been to identify the concrete steps the US must take to ensure US leadership in AI R&D. And one of the key takeaways is that's not a given, that's not automatic. We have to take active steps if we're going to ensure this. This chapter, chapter 11, is the culmination of this work. It presents a comprehensive national plan to sustain US leadership in AI and put our nation on the path to harness AI as the engine of invention that we are all confident that it will be. It is critical that we take action. I and many other commissioners have lived this, and we are seeing opportunities slipping away. The US global leadership and national security is firmly rooted in the US technological leadership that for the last 60 or 70 years has rested on a foundation of research and development. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, that foundation is starting to show cracks. The development of artificial intelligence in the United States, because of a number of factors, is getting more concentrated in fewer organizations, fewer geographic regions, less diverse participation, and fewer research pathways. And the work that got us here to this significant moment in the opening years of this brand new technology, that kind of work is getting harder and harder to accomplish, and our chapter here is about how to turn that problem around. Part of the issue here is that progress on the cutting edge now often requires access to tremendous amounts of compute and training data. And for some organizations, this is readily available, but for academics or entrepreneurs or plenty of folks throughout the United States who have big ambitions, these barriers can actually prevent participation in the new AI economy. The reason this is hurting is that the academic world, which has produced the great insights on AI for the last 50 years, is slowly bleeding almost dry from folks being brain drained from academia to industry. And that weakens our ability to train the next generations of AI leaders. And it means that the next Oppenheimer or Einstein of artificial intelligence might never exist in an academic community where they're free to pursue new directions in AI. We're worried about an exacerbated lack of diversity in the field and a real focus on commercially important research, which has shorter term commercial benefit, but might not be aligned with things needed in the great games going on national security and global security around the world. And we may be entering a world where it's harder to be an AI startup for the same reason. So the United States government holds the responsibility to reverse these trends that we have identified in the report. It must step in to provide a strategic direction and sustained resources as both a funder and consumer of advanced AI technology. We recommend action along 3 key lines of effort, which I'm going to give you little 1-minute snippets of right now. First is scaling and coordinating federal AI R&D funding. An infusion of sustained resources guided by a national strategy and distributed through a diversity of mechanisms will enable US researchers to stay at the forefront of the field. This should be accomplished by, firstly, establishing a national technology foundation, and this will be a complement to the existing National Science Foundation, and it will focus on emerging technology. We strongly recommend increasing federal funding for AI R&D at compounding levels, doubling annually to reach $32 billion a year. We strongly recommend tripling the number of national AI research institutes. And we need to launch grant awards that make big bets on the people and out-of-the-box ideas that could transform the field. The second of these lines of effort that we recommend is expanding access through a national AI research infrastructure. Democratized access to AI R&D will support more equitable growth of the field, an expansion of AI expertise across the country, and application of AI to a broader range of fields. We envision a national AI research resource to bridge the compute divide for access to government and commercial cloud-based compute resources, which will be co-located with AI-ready government and non-government data sets, educational tools, and user support. We recommend a set of domain-specific AI R&D test beds sponsored by various federal agencies. As we have discussed, and you're going to see later this afternoon, testing verification of artificial intelligence is a huge issue which will make or break future research. We recommend pipelines for the curation, hosting, and maintenance of big, complex to manage data sets for the purposes of training or testing models, and an open knowledge network to give everyone in the United States access to the big data models that define the world as it is. Third, we must leverage both sides of the public-private partnership. To do so, the government should create markets for AI and other strategic technologies because the government is a large consumer of technology. This will steer the fields towards areas of national and national security interest. The government should form a network of regional innovation clusters to foster the growth of small companies in sectors such as AI that are critical to overall US competitiveness. Further, the public sector should establish a non-profit organization to broaden AI research opportunities and support AI skills in education. And with that, I'll open the floor to my colleagues from Line of Effort 1 for additional amplifying comments. And then, of course, we're anxious to hear the discussion from the broader group. Just so you know, I'm a professor. I used to be a professor, and I'm used to staring down quiet audiences of students.
I have a couple of comments. I think the most important question I have for you, and this is for you more broadly, Andrew, in the work you and Eric and others did on technology. There is not a lot of discussion about AGI, general intelligence, in our report. And so one concern is that the research that's going on in AGI is so expensive that a very small number of players will be able to do it. I'm thinking one company in China, 3 or 4 companies in the United States, including ones we're all very associated with. Where are you in the questions about AGI, strategy, role, et cetera, in this section or somewhere else in the report?
Very good.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. We do point out this is one of the key directions, and we refer several times to the prospect of understanding the various mysteries of human intellect. And that's not necessarily going to be through the straight line paths that are today's build massive models and make them as big as you can, and that's the way to get there, although that's one approach. On that latter approach, I agree with you that there's a narrowing field of teams that have the resources to compete in that space. But I do think that there'll need to be a multi-pronged approach to answering some of the questions, whether there is something that we can say is AGI as a thing versus we're on a inclined plane towards more general AI and with different dimensions of what we might mean by that. People often refer to human-like intelligence, of various dimensions of human-like intelligence when they talk about AGI as a thing. But I agree that we might want to address this more directly, that there's a direction of work that, including from some perspectives, the pathway to more general AI that provides deep challenges to compute. resources, and very few teams have access to those resources. In part, that's addressed by the National AI resource we talk about, as well as by the calling for private investment in nonprofit support, as well as some of the other things we call for, the recommendations we make to sort of level the playing field a bit on some of those hard challenges. Those are some of my thoughts on your comments, Eric.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'd like
to. Resource is essential here, and think of the world of astronomy, where you do have thousands of researchers, and they are using like a dozen major instruments. And so, with this kind of infrastructure, I'm not expecting that 50,000 researchers will all be able to build their own GPT-3s, but I am expecting that in the academic world and in the US public sector, some people are able to build large projects which are bringing this stuff together.
Well, actually, Andrew, I'll make a chance to point out that those major assets that you're talking about are currently, as we speak, being scheduled by AI systems such as Hubble, JWST in the future. I want to sort of redirect this conversation in a slightly different direction. In addition to AGI, one of the thrusts that was identified is human-machine interaction and human-machine teaming. And then I want to say that there's actually a different dimension that we should consider emphasizing even more, which is the multi-agent aspect. So we know in human society, no person is an island. And a big part of intelligence is interacting in a society with other agents whose goals may sometimes agree with you and often may disagree. And for the foreseeable future, I don't think we're going to have an AGI, and there are other philosophical topics about potential issues with an AGI. But for the foreseeable future, AIs will be interacting with humans, and even more challengingly, we will have teams of mixed humans and AIs working together. And a big part of that is understanding their relative strengths and weaknesses and how to characterize them so that we can have the right composition and process of those teams. And so I think that's one of the central challenges in effective use of AI for national security.
Yeah, I'd like to just say that what Andrew didn't do just now was call out some of the direct topic areas that LOE1 has focused on, and I would love everyone to look at those carefully, as well as the public, to see the areas that we think are present difficult challenges, but great opportunities moving ahead with investment in AI research. On the human AI team, and just to make a comment there, when the founders of the field of AI, the folks who first used the phrase artificial intelligence in 1956, called out what the big challenges were in AI. Is it perception and learning and reasoning and natural language? They called out 4 pillars. They didn't mention very much in those days. I think that's been a framing thread for decades. They did not call out cooperative intelligence, teaming, multiple agents working together. If you think about the flourishing of human society, what makes us different than other animals on the planet? It's our incredible intelligence when it comes to cooperative activity. There's a lot to be learned about that. We know very little about that. We barely scratched the surface, I think, in that space, just to amplify a bit what Steve was saying.
Eric,
Can I?
So I'd actually like to finish my. Can I finish my point? So
Sure.
my concern is the following. Andrew used the word instruments. There's a very small number of the kinds of facilities where people can do research. And we propose in our report this national research network. And I'm concerned that this national network won't be big enough that anybody other than Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and China will be able to do the kind of research. In other words, that the facility for universities and smaller companies will simply not be big enough. And the other concern that I have is that you need massive training data in these areas. And that massive training data is often proprietary to the companies for various reasons. So it seems to me that an ideal scenario would be a very large amount of public training data and a set of very large publicly available data centers for people who don't have the wealth and resources of Google, Microsoft, et cetera, who want to do major breakthroughs in AI. That's my concern. And I'm not sure that we say that clearly enough. So that's what I'm worried about.
That was our intent. We will clarify it to make this really clear. We do expect that there needs to be a national resource for academic researchers and government research organizations to be able to operate at the same level as these giant corporations. And the issue of data, I think, is you might be overestimating that imbalance. The large models are being trained primarily on existing public text data. And so it's a pain to collect. And I want a centralized place that collects it once rather than having to have all researchers do it themselves. But that is not the end of the world. And I also want to emphasize, Eric, that none of us here know whether it turns out that these massive deep neural networks are or are not the path to what some people fancifully call general intelligence. They might be, so we have to fund them, but we cannot neglect the fact that it's just as likely to come out of some AI professor in Arkansas who sees a whole new way of applying mathematics that none of the rest of us have ever seen.
And I think
Go ahead.
Collectively, we want to make sure that the professor in Arkansas can use a new approach to do what GPT-3 and others have achieved. We want to encourage diversity of approach. We want to encourage diversity of sources. I think we all feel very strongly about that. I just want to say that I'm very concerned about the concentration of resources. Eventually ends up in a situation where it's like in physics where you have cyclotrons and everyone has to move to the cyclotron. Right. And one of the great things about computers is that the ability to innovate has been very diffused and disparate and spread very broadly. And that's one of the reasons why our field has moved ahead so quickly.
Yeah, I have to agree with Eric because while there are a lot of different approaches, we might find the answer in biology, just as much as mathematics. But if you want to go down a path where you need to throw 1 million cores at a simulation problem to do a reinforcement learning model, right? That bright young researcher in Arkansas should have the same capacity to apply that model in that kind of compute environment. And one of the things we have in national security is not just among our agencies, but among our companies, much less our universities, is a lack of sharing of compute. So everybody replicates the compute. Our defense contractors each have their own compute. Our universities have their own compute. And maybe we leverage Google and Microsoft and Amazon, but without that financial capacity to access that, the levels and the quality of the research and the results are going to be desperate. And so we need a strategy. I think you guys are trying to put that together. I would just make it a lot more explicit.
Let me also just reflect about Eric's comments just a second for a minute here. My best guess right now would be the path to more general AI along dimensions we care about right now will be combinations of some of the directions in very massive, large-scale deep neural models and some generative ideas that are more of the form that's, I'll say, aligned with what Andrew is saying, but I think it's going to be combinations and hybrids where we'll need access to some of these deeper compute resources and technologies and artifacts. And let's just, if we assume that's true, then I have to agree with Eric. Many folks, bright academics in today's world are going to be locked out of some of the biggest compute resources that are available largely in industry and just in a few places, very few places. So that should frame the way we describe what we mean when we talk about a national AI infrastructure, network, and resource. We have to really talk about what it might mean to provide similar access to the university researchers and scientists that are just in a few rarefied places now, what that would actually entail. I think that we could also think about programs, recommend rotation programs. How can industry open up its research labs and centers to academics, other kinds of programs that would provide access. So I share Eric's anxiety, even given good execution on some of the things we're asking for now, whether we'll provide that kind of laboratory environment for researchers in the US.
So I'd like to, what we're talking about is democratization of access to what is right now very regional. If I was to extract a very simple sentence from the report, it says, however, the trend of more than 90% of US innovation sector job creation occurred in just 5 major coastal cities between 2005 and 2017. I think that's somewhat being obviated right now with what we even see as a microcosm in this conversation. We're not in a location having a conversation. We are representative of a change in our ability as a society to coordinate, to collaborate. I was responsible for 5 of the quantum computing capabilities that were owned by the Department of Defense. I couldn't get but 20% of that capability utilized when I was in charge of them, and we were talking about spinning them out or selling them. We have a cultural shift occurring that'll allow us to no longer have regional skills and capabilities, that democratization for sharing of information with distributed access and validated access to it could be engaged in. And this report does say that, at least that was my interpretation. But if we haven't had it clear enough, we do need to make it clearer. It shouldn't matter whether you're in Alaska or in Timbuktu. You should be able to get to these resources appropriately vetted and start to do this collaboration. It ties to those other chapters that we talk about with talent development, protection of technology, all of those tie together to be able to afford people these access to a global or our national resource.
Andrew, can I just add a couple of comments from the audience here, just so, because they're commenting and they're asking questions. I'll just highlight 2 from Paul Nelson. One from yesterday, which I think is relevant to Chapter 11's work. He says national security threats are also might be posed by excessive concentration of market power within the AI industry or industries that deploy AI-enabled services. And his second comment that came in today says a concern on R&D, a key gap is the comparative lack of resources for objective, clear-eyed research on societal impacts. R&D can't just be about tech, but also about societal and governance questions. So I think both good comments by Paul. Over to you, Andrew, for any closing thoughts on your chapter.
Thank you for those comments. I think it's safe to say the entire Commission agrees with this concern, and you'll notice that here and in the other chapters we're really clear that we need national test beds and we need national pushes to practice what we preach, discover what it's like to actually implement these things, and embrace the wider community as you are using artificial intelligence to build useful products for good and useful products for the protection of the United States. So this chapter is absolutely, this is about the backbone of artificial intelligence research, but the entire Commission report as a whole, the backbone of research is one component of making sure that the US is practiced at putting AI into practice and involving the community and all stakeholders and public and legislation and the judicial system in figuring out how to do this stuff.
Thank you, Andrew. We will take all this conversation and we will tweak whatever needs to be tweaked in this chapter. I thank you, Dr. Moore, again. This has been a really good conversation. and the LOE1 commissioners have really taken this to the next level. I think the chapter really is reflective of that. I'll turn it over now to chapter 12. The topic of chapter 12 is intellectual property. And I'll ask Gilman Louie to present on the chapter's findings and for 5 minutes and then have a conversation.
Thanks a lot, Ilya. I want to spend a moment to discuss the importance of rethinking intellectual property in this kind of new global age of competition and the impacts around AI. I'm the chair of line of effort for Protect and Build Upon U.S. Technology. Our recommendation in Chapter 12 focuses on the importance of intellectual property policies and regimes to national priorities such as national security, economic interest, and technology competitiveness. In developing this recommendation, staff researched and analyzed current U.S. intellectual property policies and regimes, especially related to China's IP strategies. To prevent the United States from losing its global IP leadership position, especially in AI and critical emerging technologies, the United States must prioritize the development and implementation of a comprehensive IP policy. Unlike the United States, China has recognized the importance of IP policies as a critical tool within its national strategies for emerging technologies, which provides China the opportunity to, quote, fill the void, unquote, left by weakened U.S. IP protection, particularly for patents. Our overarching recommendation is that America's IP laws and institutions must be considered as critical components for safeguarding U.S. national security interests involving advanced economic prosperity and technology competitiveness. To this end, the president should issue an executive order to recognize IP as a national priority and require the development of a comprehensive plan to reform and create IP policies and regimes that further national security, economic, and technology competitiveness strategies. The Commission recommends that the Secretary of Commerce, in coordination with the Director of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, develop proposals to reform and establish new IP policies and regimes as needed to incentivize, expand, and protect AI and emerging technologies. The Secretary's IP proposals should include an assessment of a non-exhaustive list of IP considerations identified by the Commission. These proposals should be provided to the Vice President as chair of the NSCAI's recommended Technology Competitiveness Council, or otherwise as chair of an interagency task force. The Technology Competitiveness Council, or the Vice President, should determine which proposals made by the Secretary of Commerce should be elevated and integrated into national security, economic interests, and technology competitiveness strategies. The Commission has not taken a position on how these proposals for IP policies should come out. Rather, the Commission recognizes the need for a comprehensive series of IP policies. There are a lot of diverse perspectives when it comes to IP and where the dial should be set on IP rights, particularly for patents. Our recommendation, especially in light of the fact that China is pulling all of its IP levers to booster its national priorities, is that the U.S. IP policy should be optimized to strengthen and safeguard national security interests, such as economic prosperity and technology competitiveness. Proposing IP policies and regimes will require a whole-of-government approach led by the Secretary of Commerce and the USPTO Director. This will, of course, require engaging with industry and academia to hear their perspectives. The Department of Commerce and the USPTO have experience and expertise in convening these types of dialogues. I would now like to open up the floor for discussion. I don't quite have the same power as a university professor to cold call, but I'm sure many of you have viewpoints around IP and you know, let me just frame this by kind of the old framing. And the old framing of IP protection is to protect the inventor's rights. And I think that continues to be important. It's kind of the foundation of invention and the protection of invention and discovery in the United States. I think the world though is shifting from, the US as being the concentration of center of many of these activities to a more broader global competition. And it's pretty clear as in my remarks that China is aggressively moving out on the IP front as a way for it to project not only its capabilities, but also to project its power. And we may need to rethink how we apply IP on topics like software and other kinds of things that are important to AI, using a more global strategic viewpoint rather than just the individual inventor's viewpoint.
Well, Gilman, I think that's one of the challenges in sort of the new situation. So, during the Cold War, there were two differences. One is there was less crossover between commercial applications and defense applications, and second of all, we were not so closely intertwined in 1970. The economies were not quite so intertwined between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, we faced tremendous new challenges in trying to differentiate, what's an appropriate response and what's an appropriate policy to protect things. And then on top of that, I think the entire world has struggled with this challenge of the relationship, what's IP in the software world. Many institutions still believe that the correct way to protect your rights in software is copyright, which we all know there are many challenges to, using copyright to protect software rights. So I would just say that this is a tremendously challenging and dynamic situation and not particularly unique to national security.
Thank you, Steve. I'd just like to add and ask Rama Aluru on the team. She's detailed from PTO's office. She's a judge by profession, and she really worked hard on this issue. We have consulted with current PTO director and the previous PTO directors. But Rama, if you want to add any comments to what Gilman's already talked about.
Thank you, Lee. Sure. In addition to echoing what the commissioners have already commented on, I want to emphasize the importance of elevating IP policies and regimes to a national priority. Some of our IP policies and regimes are antiquated, and some IP levers can be pulled to further our economic interests as well as our tech competitiveness positions. And to do that, we need some more attention on our IP policies and regimes, and that's what our recommendation gets at.
Yeah, and I think the staff did a great job, particularly your work on this area, because many of these battles are not actually playing out in U.S. courts anymore. A lot of the issues around IP and patents are being kind of litigated in international courts. So again, we have to look at it a more holistic viewpoint of what we're willing to protect versus what other people are willing to protect, and how that's going to play out in a long-term benefit, not just protecting the invention, but protecting national security as well.
Gilman and Rama, if you could comment on the sense that the U.S. patent policies have moved away dramatically from even reviewing and providing protection for what are considered software innovations. And a lot of what we're talking about will be in the world of code as opposed to hardware. Do you make a comment on that? Because I think this is a huge change over the last maybe 8 or 9 years.
It is. There's been a line of cases since 2010 that have contracted what sort of inventions are eligible for patent protection, and that has really affected software inventions. And so that is one of the areas that we list as needing attention, patent eligibility, under our non-exhaustive list of IP considerations.
I think we're going to have to rethink, the issues. Software has been a challenge with the patent office because it's it covers and touches so many different things, right? And is it the words or the code that we're trying to protect, or what that code does? And I think in a world where the world is becoming more about bits than about atoms, we're going to have to look at that and look at that hard, because the power of even hardware of the future is going to be driven by software, and much of that software is going to be driven by AI.
Yeah, my understanding with that these talking to patent teams that I've worked with is that this kind of push away from software, which is a pretty, as you say, it's a big category, includes procedures and lots of the intellect that runs on top of the hardware, has pushed innovation into non-disclosure and trade secret, which is not good for the larger community of innovation.
Particularly if you have competitive nations where one is relying on trade secrets and the other one is relying on their own implementation of their own patent laws, as it would play out in courts. So you might say, I have this trade secret, you know, and I want to go global with it. And another country says, no, we have patents. These are all been patented, they're prior works. So again, we're not taking a position of what the results should be, but rather that this is a serious issue and we need to elevate it at a national level, that this is a critical part of our AI strategy, as well as our emerging technology strategies, is to reform and think about more holistically our patent and IP protection regimes.
This plays a lot in terms of how companies, I know you all will know this, but having worked on the other side trying to define what is or isn't IP was always a challenge for me as an engineer to work through when I was trying to execute a contract. And to me, this is so important and fundamentally must be changed, because it absolutely wraps up the government forever trying to parse out what's in or not in the contract and how and what use or utility they had with those rights for application, for future, for sustaining activities, whatever. Totally agree.
So I'd like to use a comment from the audience. This is from Peter McKinnon, who says that IP is also subject to the WIPO rules and conventions, so no country can go it alone. Trade secret is underutilized, in my view, as a novel way to protect such IP as software. So Rama or Gilman, any comments from you or any other commissioners?
Well, I think WIPO rules is a good foundational set, right? But a lot of these new inventions, particularly if they're grounded in foundational elements that standards are built from, you know. So we can see this happening right now in China, where China, you know, their engineers and inventors are inventing and creating new pieces of technology, just like we have in the US. But China has also been much more aggressive in the US to move on the standards bodies. You know, a good example of that is in the 5G and the telecommunications space. Now, they find that, you know, their patents are foundational to setting those standards that advantages one country over the next. So it's more than just simply an issue of, you know, winning a dispute. It's foundational. And again, it goes back to thinking through what your strategies are, and how we build things from those strategies, particularly around those pieces of IP. And while I agree that trade secrets in many cases have been underutilized in software, kind of given the nature of how software gets created, with, you know, blending and mixing of open source or proprietary software and a lot of derivative works, I think it can be very challenging for any company, much less, you know, any organization, to rely simply on trade secrets to protect their software. And we know that copyright rules are pretty weak.
Rob, anything from you on this question, or I think Gilman covered it pretty well?
Sure. There are benefits to trade secrets, and there's certainly benefits to open source as well. And some of our most recent machine learning breakthroughs have been based on open source, and our patent protections have to be balanced against these IP protection and interest. And it's just that balance that we say needs to be examined to make sure that it is aligned with public-private partnerships and collaboration.
Thanks, Rom. I think this also addresses a comment by Emma. And she says online, on this topic of IP and software, do you think that open source code will need to face more regulation have you thought of how legal protections can work for open source? I think you were just talking about that balance.
Yeah, it's a balance, right? I mean, look, open source is powered up, many great capabilities in software. Because it's fundamentally the importance of the ability to share and amplify, to take somebody else's work and other people's works and aggregate them into better works. And so it's foundational as well. And so getting that right balance between trade secrets, patents, open source, and copyright protection with that international global framing of the problem is what the US needs to judge holistically across all the different tools of IP, not just in each one of the regimes.
Thank you, Gilman. If there are no other comments, we will take the feedback from this conversation on the chapter regarding IP and see what needs to be updated. Thank you, Rama, as well. I'll turn over now to chapter 13 that deals with a really current and hot topic of microelectronics. And for that, I'll turn over to Chris Darby to do a 5-minute introduction, and then we can have a conversation. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Ely. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be presenting Chapter 13 on microelectronics. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. Working with my fellow commissioners, Gilman Louie and Jason Matheny, and supported by a truly extraordinary staff, our group has prepared recommendations to protect and promote U.S. strategic advantages in microelectronics. Because, put bluntly, without microelectronics, there is no AI. As such, the Commission assesses that U.S. leadership in microelectronics is critical to overall U.S. leadership in artificial intelligence. We reached this conclusion because hardware is a foundational element of the AI stack, and exponential increases in computational power that have driven the last decade in AI machine learning are absolutely the fundamental differentiator going forward. But U.S. leadership in microelectronics has eroded. Decades of offshoring has shifted the majority of advanced semiconductor manufacturing to East Asia, leaving the U.S. reliant on foreign sources of production for the cutting-edge microelectronics and semiconductors that are critical for defense systems and industry more broadly. Our recommendations offer steps to rebuild U.S. leadership in microelectronics, starting with setting an explicit goal of staying 2 generations ahead of China in the state-of-the-art microelectronics and maintaining multiple sources of cutting-edge domestic merchant fabrication capacities. These recommendations build upon the microelectronics provisions that exist in the 2021 NDAA, which the Commission has previously endorsed as a critical first step in regaining U.S. microelectronics leadership. I'll now briefly outline our 3 recommendations, including first, establishing a U.S. microelectronics strategy, second, creating new incentives for domestic fabrication, and third, increasing microelectronics research funding. I'll then open the floor for deliberation with my fellow commissioners and discuss these recommendations. So beginning with the National Microelectronics Strategy as a starting point and as a subset of a macro level national technology strategy that we discussed yesterday, the United States needs a national strategy to coordinate semiconductor policy, funding, and incentives within the executive branch and externally with industry and academia. The NDAA directs the Executive Office of the President to create a new National Science and Technology Council subcommittee on microelectronics leadership and to complete the National Microelectronics Strategy. The Commission recommends that the White House prioritize this statutory requirement and quickly set the executive branch's strategic direction on microelectronics and semiconductor leadership. Secondly, we recommend, and this recommend really focuses on fabrication. The Commission has previously concluded that the U.S. is overly dependent upon a globally diversified supply chain for microelectronics, including mission-critical imports that could be cut off by foreign government actions or by natural disasters. And without several US-based cutting-edge fabrication facilities, both US industry and US national security interests face risks from competitive pressures and supply chain shortages. The Commission recommends that Congress establish a 40% refundable tax credit to incentivize the construction of multiple leading-edge merchant fabrication facilities domestically by US and allied firms. Third, and finally, the category of recommendations, this following category of recommendations really deals with research and the way to lead the next generation of microelectronics. To do so, it requires funding a portfolio approach with pathways that prioritize things like advanced packaging techniques, novel materials, and entirely new hardware approaches such as quantum and neuromorphic architectures. Staying ahead in microelectronics will require substantially expanding federally funded research at DOE, DARPA, NSF, and other government research organizations by, we estimate, roughly $12 billion over the next 5 years. We recommend that this funding should focus on packaging by establishing the Advanced Packaging National Manufacturing Program, as well as other promising microelectronics research areas described in our report. So with that, Ely, I will close and open it to the floor for discussion. Over.
Thank you, Chris.
So Chris, I agree with everything in our report and everything you've said. I'm concerned that, again, it's not aggressive enough. And let me give you the argument. Let's assume that everybody wants 5 nanometer chips. And let's further assume that the cost of a 5 nanometer chip is much greater than the cost of a 7 nanometer chip in terms of the manufacturing. So the most likely scenario is a relatively small number of very, very expensive fabs around the world. And that's what we're seeing now. And the reason is, first, it takes a lot of capital to build the fabs. But second, these chips are relatively small and relatively inexpensive. And so you have to sell a lot of them. So I'm worried, just as I was worried about AGI, that the structure of AI is pushing to have a very small number of leading firms at the software and hardware level, and that it will be very difficult to get the kind of competitiveness that you're describing with many different sources, which in my comments echo the departure of the semiconductor industry from the United States, with the exception of Intel, more than a decade ago. Do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, Eric, I totally. I think it is always going to be hard to keep up in the race, whether it's 7 to 5, 5 to 3, and it will be expensive. I think one of the things that the Commission and our committee specifically wanted the government to focus on was packaging. The notion of chiplets and these small components that can be designed in unique ways, combined with unique architectures like stackable architectures, can really, over a long period of time, differentiate beyond just that baseline 7 nanometer, 5 nanometer, and down to 3 nanometer semiconductor form factor. We believe that it's going to be the way you construct them and the way you architect them in novel ways over the next probably 10 years that really differentiates. Over. And I would invite Jason and Gilman to weigh in as they also did a lot of work in this. Jason?
Nothing to add from me. That was great. Gilman?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I mean, well, the challenge on the fabrication is clear, right? But also, making the tools available so people can actually begin to construct these new ways of packaging these components together that gives us novel capabilities. I think there's a lot of room for innovation there, and we should double down on that side of the equation as well.
Hey, Eric.
One other thought, sorry, just to add on to that. I mean, I think NIST has done a pretty good job of setting up some access to manufacturing capabilities that aren't at the most advanced node, but do democratize a bit more the access to dielectric etch and some lithography tools. I think thinking about ways of scaling that up would be helpful.
Hey, Eric.
Sorry, yeah, Eric.
When you talked about wanting to be more aggressive, what did you mean? Did you mean kind of being more aggressive in the government playing a bigger hand financially or with incentives, or do you mean something else?
I'm not exactly sure, Andy. It seems to me that let me start over. I've been on many commissions which have talked about the US semiconductor problem. And my observation is it's a really hard problem. We want to have these things in the United States. We want them to be manufactured here. The economics seem to favor in Asia right now. And whether we solve that by subsidies or by new technology or by Chris Darby's suggestion of different packaging, I'm not sure. But I think we should take a strong, if you think about the future of AI, if the future of AI is defined by chips that are not made in the US, that is a national security issue. And we have to talk about it.
Yeah.
Now, maybe the answer is we love Taiwan because of TSMC, and our entire doctrine, I'm making this up, is all around keeping TSMC happy. But if that's true, then we should say it. And if it's not true, we should offer an alternative.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I also
Eric,
think the last thing I'll quickly say is I think that it's implicit in the report, but I might be more explicit. It's not, right now, it's not like the US has a generation or two advantage and we want to maintain two generation advantages over China. We're behind, or behind 2 generation challenges over other countries. In the US, we're behind now by a generation or 2.
Yeah, so just to agree with Andy and Eric from some of the conversations and investigations that I've been doing on this front, calling out the national security risk to continuing on the path we're on, I think is very important, and highlighting that more in our document. And the prospect of even losing access to the fabs that we depend on now, to one way or another in the future.
But it's affecting our supply chain of innovation as well. You know, it's very difficult if you're a startup to get funding. If you say you want to go make ICs, everybody goes running for the hills. Yes, there's fab lists. Yes, there's other methods to do certain classes of work. But that concentration, not just, in a handful of companies, but in a handful of countries, I think Andy, is right. I mean, we're struggling here in the US, great companies like Intel is struggling to try to get 7 nanometers to work. TSMC is already on 5, heading towards 3. Samsung is already down at 5. So we're, yes, the Chinese are behind us, but, playing in the middle of the pack isn't a strategy to win.
I also think,
Chris, I think one of the strategies that we talked about is how do we convince TSMC and Samsung to build more manufacturing in the U.S. And I'm curious, since you were VP of Intel, I'm sure that federal and state governments floated all sorts of incentives to nudge Intel and other companies to place manufacturing in one place versus another. In the chapter, we recommend tax incentives as the most effective nudge. Are there other incentives that you think are important and that deserve more consideration?
Well, I think tax incentives are helpful on the cost side. I think contracts are always valuable. And with Pat Gelsinger taking the helm of Intel, I think there could be a shifting conversation with Intel, if I know Pat at all. I'd like to come back though and just reinforce that we haven't universally lost our edge in microelectronics. If you think about the tool sets that are needed to manufacture these advanced fabrication facilities, the U.S. still has a very dominant position on tool sets, and we need to double down in that area. Things like next generation lithography or etching capabilities, we need to invest in those. And one of my worries is that these are not popular targets for traditional private equity investments as good ones. So the government may have a role to play in beefing up investments in, for example, microelectronic tool sets. Packaging is important, and if you think about really innovative, fabulous design semiconductor, U.S. is still very, very aggressive and dominant, and some of the AI-specific designs that are out there are really impressive. The problem is they have to go to merchant fab facilities offshore in order to get their designs actually implemented. And we just need to change that. We need that merchant fab capacity here in the U.S. We need to continue to double down on R&D. We need to think about maintaining and actually increasing our lead on the tool sets. And I think if we do all of those things in combination, we will have a very, or we can rebuild a very robust and strong position in microelectronics. Over.
So can I just start? Oh, sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Just very briefly, I think one other point you made earlier, Chris, that I would underline, and I think we have to try to be vigilant about, is trying to have multiple fabs that are successful in the U.S. Because I think the fact that really we only had one viable one for a long time is part of what pushed people towards TSMC.
Yeah, I would agree.
So
Look, Andy, you're right, because Intel has not been a merchant fab, and we need merchant fab capacity, and it shouldn't be, probably to your point, just TSMC. And I think if you think about the bills that Senators Corner and Warner have really put forth, they're about any strong merchant fab investment, whether it's coming from Samsung or from TSMC. And I would want Pat to rethink Intel's position over a period of time.
So we can't, I'm not sure we're going to write in Intel strategy in our document, but I agree with both Chris and Andy here. It seems to me that we need a set of goals for this, which say something along the lines of, we need in the US competitive foundries, which is defined as more than one. They need to be at the state of the art. So for example, I'm concerned that TSMC and Samsung are building fabs in the US, but that their most advanced fabs are in Korea and Taiwan, right? So one of the criteria here is to make sure you understand what you're actually getting, because these are very expensive things. I think that the best possible outcome for America's national security would be to have the leading fabs globally be in the United States along with elsewhere, and that our military has good access to all of that in ways that we can specify.
The thing I would add to what Eric was saying that a lot of people forget is that it takes real operational skills to operate these foundries at peak efficiencies. And we've lost that muscle memory, right? So it's not just building the plants here, right? We got to rebuild the not just the tooling, but the actual skills that it takes to operate these fabs at these, very small, size gates that we're talking about. And so this is no good to put a, 21 or 14 nanometer fab here. What we need are the state of the art, where people are solving really tough problems. And that skill builds an industrial base that then allows us to have other industries to be built around it.
I'm enthusiastic about making this chapter more ambitious, and I really like pursuing this along the lines that Eric and Gilman just suggested. And I think that it's good timing, because I mean, not only did Congress show its appetite for this in the last NDAA, but the president's campaign promises of having a manufacturing agenda with $400 billion in new procurement for U.S. made goods, including semiconductors, I think offers a window of opportunity here.
Thank you, Jason. If there are no other comments, we will take this feedback and update the chapter. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason, who will talk to us about Chapter 14 on technology protection. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Illy. So Chapter 14 was led by Commissioners Chris Darby, Gilman Louie, and myself, and our superb staff Chris McGuire, Kevin McGinnis, and Parker Wild. Our recommendations in this chapter aim to enable the U.S. to better protect existing technology advantages without hindering innovation, with an emphasis on not hindering innovation. We believe our country will play more to our asymmetric strengths as an open society by focusing on promotion rather than protection, but we can't afford to neglect protection. Even in an open society, we're not going to usually leave our cars unlocked with our keys in the ignition, but in some domains of technology, that's effectively what we've been doing. So we do need to work harder to ensure that our citizens are rewarded for their creativity and hard work without other countries stealing that work and then selling it as their own. And to that end, we have several recommendations in this chapter. The first is that the US should more closely integrate its tech protection policies with its promotion policies for technology so that they actually match rather than work against one another. And this requires a more strategic approach of the type we've been talking about today and yesterday that develops a technology strategy that works across agencies and gives increased technical capacity to key departments that are responsible for tech protection, especially Commerce, Treasury, and State. So they need to increase their tech personnel in order to support more rapid design of effective policies, and that is mostly a personnel issue, and it carries the same themes that we discussed earlier today on how to attract and develop technical talent within the federal workforce. But we also need an interagency process at the White House that does allow agencies to have a coordinated strategy rather than work at cross purposes. That is, our export controls need to be aligned at State and Commerce and DoD, and those need to be aligned with our investment screening strategies at Treasury. Second, the United States should enhance its ability to monitor investments from competitors in critical US technology industries. CFIUS should be amended to require disclosure of investments by Russia and China and US companies that involve key technologies. Third, export control should be implemented carefully and in coordination with US allies, targeting a very small number of choke points that are key to sensitive industries. So our current export control list contains thousands of technologies, and we simply don't have the resources to monitor and enforce all of those. So rather than dilute our limited ability to monitor and enforce, we should focus on a much smaller number of key technologies. Or in the word of Bob Gates, I think he said, have a small yard with a tall fence. So export controls on things like general use AI algorithms are really unlikely to be cost effective in our view, given their widespread use. In contrast, controls on key components that are needed to produce critical pieces of AI related hardware are more likely to be effective. And to Chris Darby's point and discussing the last chapter, the US really has an enviable position in being at a few key choke points related to tools that are used to manufacture semiconductors. We should make sure that we keep that advantage by having targeted controls on key semiconductor manufacturing equipment that's closely coordinated with our allies and partners, especially Japan and the Netherlands. In addition, although list-based controls on general use chips are unlikely to be effective, targeted in-use controls on specific high-end chips should at least allow US firms to monitor where their chips are going so that they don't wittingly or unwittingly enable uses of AI that violate human rights. And a recent example of this was the discovery that a large-scale computing facility in Xinjiang that's being used for surveillance of prison camps is run on American chips. So we should have the controls that at least allow us to understand where those chips are going and how they're being used. Fourth, the United States should build capacity to protect its research enterprise as a national asset. And this requires government agencies, law enforcement, and research institutions to have ready access to the tools and data needed to conduct risk assessments. We recommend that Congress establish a government-sponsored but externally managed Center of Excellence on Research Security, probably at a university-affiliated research center, since they understand some of the constraints that universities are already facing. Federal agencies should in turn work with research institutions to ensure that practices are in place to protect research data and provide timely and actionable alerts on cyber threats. Finally, the US should implement a visa review process for advanced degree students and researchers with ties to research institutions that are affiliated with foreign military and intelligence services. We discussed at great length the question of blanket prohibitions on such visas and ultimately came down against them because in many cases, there might be advantages given the insights that we'll gain into some of those institutions. But those visas deserve special review to assess the risks and benefits. That's our last recommendation for this chapter, and now I'll open to discussion.
Thanks, Jason. And since we're waiting for the commissioners to comment on anything, Chris McGuire, do you have any comments from the staff since you were the lead on our end on this chapter?
Sure, I'll just say briefly, I think Jason did a great job as an overview, just to highlight there's a lot of things that we are behind on in this space as well. Just there were some good steps that were taken in the last couple of years, especially ECRA and FIRMA, to modernize export controls, but those required, for instance, the US government to come up with a list of emerging and foundational technologies. That was almost 3 years ago. And we haven't published a single technology under those lists yet. And there's some reasons for that. And some of those are the things that Jason outlined in terms of the need to be careful, which is extremely important, and also the resourcing problems, which are very real. But the fact is, the administration has even been guided to do more on this and really hasn't done it yet. So there are definitely big steps that we need to make on technology protection across the board.
So having used what used to be a system called the Material Critical Technology List, for those that remember something that's really outdated, it failed. So I was very interested to see how this was constructed, and I think it gives us a better framework. One of the challenges in the critical technology list is that it wasn't managed, it wasn't supported, it wasn't understood. And so there's a lot here that I think industry could have a very good comment in on to help us do this appropriately. But I think it also needs to have that national security edge and not just the one-sided view that it unfortunately became over time. So yeah, I really appreciate the work done on this chapter, as well with IP.
I think this is hard because, look, we have good people working this problem every day. But the screening process for it to be effective needs to be thorough. And we have a talent gap, right? We don't have enough bodies, and maybe one day we could apply AI and ML on this particular task. And in fact, it's one of our recommendations that we may head down in that path, at least start to do the research on that. But without the talent to do the screening, showing up with a bunch of things on the list is not particularly useful. And so that's kind of the comment around, small yard, tall fence. Pick the things that really, really matter, right? Protect them appropriately. Focus on the actual threat. Try not to generalize it to the point where, it's not enforceable.
It looks like there was a question by YouTube that's interesting from Paul Nelson, the second part of which I'll address, which is, how do you handle potential tensions with US firms favoring fewer export controls? This is challenging. To give one recent example, the Department of Commerce put out an entity listing for the SMIC facility in China that applied to US products that were uniquely required for manufacturing semiconductors at 10 nanometers or below. And it turns out that there are no such US products. And it looks like that, U.S. industry was especially unhappy with the prospect of not being able to sell tools to that facility and sort of pushed back on the prospect of such controls. This is going to be a challenge, and I think the government is going to need to understand what are the costs and benefits from those controls. What do we lose in terms of revenue, and how much of that revenue would have gone into research and development that ultimately makes us more competitive. Our recommendations in this chapter are to really focus on that very small percentage of tools that are needed for the most advanced manufacturing, and that then allows companies to retain most of their revenue.
I want to follow up on this, Jason. I don't care about the big companies; they can handle themselves. They're fine. But I'm actually concerned about AI startups. And here in Pittsburgh, I've had a few phenomenon where robotic startups have been actually pressured by their board to move out of the United States because of the risk that they could become export controlled. And I'm wondering if this was just a small phenomenon that I happen to observe here, or if there is a general concern about investing in startups in the United States that may end up having the export control label slapped on them.
Chris Darby, have you experienced that with any of the companies you've been working with?
Yeah, I think it's a concern of all small companies. However, I would say that the thing that we hear most from small companies, and I think Gilman would probably echo this, is they just seek clarity. They want quick answers, and they want streamlined process where streamlined process can be put in place. That's the bigger challenge, because then it becomes a business decision after that. So rattling the sword about moving out of the United States, we hear less of that. We certainly hear more of, boy, the process is cumbersome, and I wish it could be just clear. Make it easy for us to do business with the company or the countries where it should be easy, and tell us explicitly, quickly, where we can't go. Over.
Yeah, I think clarity is the answer. The issue, there's been a number of companies that I'm familiar with where they just didn't know. And in fact, I remember with one company, they filed for an export license and went on for like 3 or 3.5 months before somebody came back and went back to the company and said, for this category, you don't need to file it. So that lack of clarity, and this is, why it's important for us to, be much more definitive on the list, be much more definitive on the areas that we're concerned about. And even, concepts around a simple help desk that companies can call in and say, here's my category. Does this fall underneath your cover? And right now, little companies, who can't afford the big law firms who have, whole regimes of lawyers working these particular issues, they're kind of out there on their own, and that stifles innovation. So,
but I also want to bring up that there are indirect effects that impact large companies. So in the space sector, we're working to partner to bring COTS technologies and apply them to the space sector. And let's just say that we have large partners who are not hugely supportive of this, precisely because they worry that if their products start flying on all these spacecraft, they will become export controlled, and that will have negative effects on their commercial business, which has quite a few more zeros behind it.
And the least competent person is in charge of making those decisions. So that was one of the reasons why I was very interested in this chapter, the way it was constructed, because right now we have a GS9 or an individual who has no technical background trying to arbitrate between what is and who's to talk to try to define what is exported and what's not. The approach here is more, I believe, towards having the appropriate people with the interest focused on getting that export control. So it'll be very important in the implementation plan to highlight how that's constructed.
Great point. Thank you.
Jason, if there are any other comments, I'll conclude this conversation on this chapter. I thank you and Chris and the team here for chapter 14. I think it's a really good, meaty. I think in addition to everything else you guys have done, in the previous quarters, we also had a draft executive orders. So whoever is in the executive branch can easily take those documents. And we have provided a lot of work so you can start from, not from scratch, but actually you have something to build on and move out on all these policies. With that, I'll turn over to chapter 15. Allies and partners and the international order has come up in many of the conversations so far in all of the chapters. And I think we have dedicated a special chapter on how we would go about in addressing the international order when it comes to digital technologies, especially AI. I think there are a lot of papers out there that talk about different modalities of how you build coalition in this new age. But I think this chapter that is done by Jason and the LOE 5 commissioners with the team really goes deeper and provides a clue, a clear blueprint on how you build certain coalitions when it comes to these technologies. So without further ado, I'll turn over again to Jason to lead the conversation, and then Paul from the team if he wants to add anything. Thank you.
Thanks, Illy. And I'm so sorry to everyone who has to listen to me talk for another round. You should have spaced these out at least so people could listen to somebody else. The commissioners involved in this chapter include Chris Darby, Gilman Louie, and myself again. And our brilliant staff on this chapter are Paul Lucas, Matt Cordova, Christy Lawrence, and Rebecca Kennel. I thought for this chapter, I'd start just by editorializing a bit about how I see the major asymmetric strengths of the US in AI compared to China. So what are strengths that the US has that China can't easily copy or imitate? And I think the first is one we talked about earlier today, which is our ability to attract global talent. Immigration has just been critical to our technological leadership during the last century. I think it'll become even more critical as we compete against a country that's 4 times our size. Succeeding in a technology competition is partly a numbers game, and we just can't succeed without more players on our team. The second asymmetric advantage that we have is what we just talked about with Chris Darby, is our position in the global microelectronics supply chain that has given us a lead that we can sustain if we make the right investments and if we don't stand still. And then the third asymmetric advantage, I'd argue, is what we'll discuss in this chapter, which is that we have true allies in the world. We have friends in the world who share our commitment to democratic values, to human rights, self-determination, free and open societies that unleash innovation. And those aren't just transactional friendships. These are friendships that are based on a shared commitment to values. And that is a powerful advantage when we leverage it. So in this chapter, we focus on the mechanisms that are needed to marshal our international allies around AI. These recommendations build on the work that we did last year, including the recommendations to reorient US diplomacy around technology, to improve US posture around international technical standards organizations such as ISO, to foster stronger relationships with our allies and partners around emerging technologies, and to improve AI cooperation with our Five Eyes and NATO allies. In particular, we recommend that the State Department work with allies and partners to synchronize international development assistance funds to develop, promote, and fund the adoption of AI and associated technologies in ways that advance democratic values and ethical norms around openness, privacy, security, and reliability. That is, what is the development plan that can serve as a substitute for the Belt and Road Initiative? And what's the infrastructure that goes along with that in ways that are privacy preserving? Second, State Department should work with NIST to emphasize the role of international technology standards in promoting safe and trustworthy technical standards for AI, and the need to protect international standard setting bodies from strong arm tactics that other countries are employing. Those are supposed to be neutral technical bodies that are really focused on getting the technology right. but they have been used as a geopolitical battleground, and we need to get savvier about how those bodies are being leveraged. Third, State Department should work with key allies and partners to establish a joint research effort that focuses on secure and privacy-preserving AI methods that can allow democratic nations to better compete. When we have methods that require centralizing lots of data, often private data, that's not good for privacy. It's also not good for security. So one advantage that democratic nations have is that they would like to have privacy-preserving computing methods, such as differential privacy or distributed learning, federated learning, homomorphic encryption, other methods that are compatible with democratic norms. Fourth, the State Department and DHS should work together to enable foreign researchers' involvement in collaborative R&D by leveraging existing visa programs. And then our chapter goes into recommendations to reorient the Department of State for competition in the digital age. These recommendations build on earlier work that we did. First, we support the department's efforts to launch a Bureau of Cyberspace Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, led by an ambassador at large. And I commend the State Department on its brilliant choice of acronym. We also recommend that the department double down on its efforts to recruit and train technical talent. The department should enhance its presence in foreign and U.S. technology hubs with a cohort of dedicated technology officers at U.S. missions. And we've seen the beginnings of this. In fact, one of the leaders at State Department around technology diplomacy, Matt Chezin, is going into a new role in Japan focused on just this sort of technology diplomacy effort. Foreign Service Institute courses should include AI-related technology modules to ensure that U.S. diplomats are equipped to lead in an environment that's transformed by emerging technology. To be successful, the State Department is going to need more resources for technology diplomacy, and Congress will be a key partner for appropriations to augment our diplomatic corps. As Bob Gates also noted, diplomacy should be our national security policy of first resort, not last resort. And this is just as true of our national security policies that are relevant to technology. Accordingly, we included a longer-term recommendation in this chapter to create an Undersecretary of State for Science, Research, and Technology. We believe that technology diplomacy will be a central feature of U.S. foreign policy going forward, and technology will need the same sort of standing within the State Department that it already enjoys in other departments, from defense to commerce, energy, all of which have a technology-focused undersecretary. And with that, I'll turn it open to our discussion.
Well, Jason, it's Eric. It seems to me that the State Department took our initial recommendations very strongly. So I wanted to emphasize, I think that they really did take the message, and they're busy doing these things. I think we're going to have a pretty big win there.
Yeah, strong agreement, Eric. And thanks to the colleagues we worked with in the last quarter and the quarter before for being so collegial with us, and really, I think, working constructively to figure out what they could do near term, midterm, long term. It's really encouraging.
So Jason, who had CSET?
Go ahead, Chris.
Who had CSET first? Was it State or was it you?
We'll see what the courts decide on that. I'm just kidding. We're thrilled. We're so happy. I mean, it gives us like a signal boost. Plus, it'll make our fellowships to the State Department, which we have like a CSET fellowship at State Department. Now the paperwork will be a ton easier because it'll just be a CSET fellowship at CSET.
All right, thank you.
Paul, from the team, anything you want to add that we haven't covered so far?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you, Jason, and to all the commissioners. Jason, you did speak about a coordinated international development assistance effort. I wondered if you could speak for a moment about the recommendation to create an emerging technology coalition.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So there have been a lot of different proposals for creating new technology alliances, including even new treaty alliances that would involve voting mechanisms or consensus. Our view is that we instead should be leveraging a less formal framework in which members of coalitions, depending on the topic, can organize their activities in a way that's in sync with one another, but without requiring new treaties. So we think that we can leverage many of the existing multilateral and plurilateral relationships for achieving a lot of technology diplomacy goals, but we do need something like a coalition to be organizing those existing alliances. Paul, anything you want to add?
No, I think that's very helpful. Thank you so much. Happy to address questions if there are any.
And Jason, there was a question we received from Peter Brown. He's asking, let me just the question. He says, given the increased role of IT standardization globally, any thoughts regarding the need to prepare and train a cadre of public and private sector actors to engage in defending their case in the increasingly competitive standards world? Is this purely State Department responsibility for defending U.S. interests, or does it go deeper?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it does go deeper. I think in particular, NIST plays a key role in this, and we've called for a task force to be organized around AI technical standard setting that would include NIST, State Department, USAID, as well as parts of the IC and DoD. We've also called on Congress to provide funds to support personnel that are focused on international standards. To give an anecdote about this, there are people within the agencies right now who want to be involved in the standard setting process, but they simply don't have the budgets or the personnel. I mean, NIST often doesn't have the travel budget to allow them to go to the key technical standards meetings for AI. So in contrast, say to China, that might have 30 representatives, including government and industry at the table. They've had a pre-meeting in which they've organized what their positions are, not only internally, but also with key Belt and Road Initiative members that are forming a voting bloc. In many cases, the U.S. government doesn't attend at all. And we simply need to be more present than we have been historically.
Thanks, Jason. I have two more questions. One from our friend Jeff Odlum, who says, excellent work by LE5 team. Does the commission believe that there is an interest among U.S. tech companies to work closely with State Department? And then a question from Paul Nelson via YouTube, who says a couple of points to highlight for Chapter 15. One, U.S. interests are advanced via strong engagement on development of assistance to build skills, create overseas partners, firms, academia, etc. Jason or Paul, if you want to take any of those questions.
Yeah, great to see Jeff online, and great question. I think there is strong interest in U.S. tech. I mean, I think the technology companies have been the ones that have gotten a front seat view of the strong arm tactics at some of the standard setting bodies by some of the countries there that are forming voting blocs, and they're concerned about the ways in which that standard setting will be manipulated. So I think ensuring that these processes are fair is something that they're very interested in, and helping the U.S. government and other democratic governments help to police the standard setting to ensure that they're not coerced is important. I think the other question about from Paul Nelson about highlighting engagement on development assistance. He lists a variety of things that I think are important and we would agree with. It's not just about technology or infrastructure, it's also about skill building. This is something that we've heard from USAID as well as from IFC and parts of the World Bank that it's not just the tech that you deliver, you also need to support the local workforce in understanding how those technologies are going to be maintained. Over.
Thank you, Jason.
Just a comment back to this idea of weaving our chapters together, for telling a coherent story. 15 really dovetails nicely with 7 and 8 in terms of some of the requirements, tools, values, issues, norms, expectations for the U.S. as well as other countries in the world.
I agree, Dr. Horowitz, and we will do that for the next iteration of the report. Anything else, Jason or Paul? Yeah.
No, it's a great point from Eric. Strong agreement.
Paul, anything from you?
I would only add in response to the last comment from the audience that the USAID digital strategy is definitely something that the Commission has looked at. And it's one of a number of programs that I think build into what Jason was speaking to in terms of not only trying to synchronize development assistance, but also to try to improve the provision of development assistance through the tools that are available to the U.S. government. So it's a great note, and we appreciate that.
I would emphasize that many of our allies hope to be able to work more closely with the U.S. Because of the compute problems that we mentioned in earlier sections, the comments that were made today by Eric. Our experience is the more pooling of ideas, the more sharing of resources, the faster we're going to get down the path of developing next generation AI that can address really difficult problems.
Thank you, Gilman. Jason, if you don't have anything else on this chapter, I'd appreciate your time and presentation of 2 chapters today. Thank you so much and all the efforts that you have put in these chapters. With that, I'll turn over to chapter 16, which is our last chapter, and Gilman Louie, who's going to present for the next 5 minutes on the key findings of this chapter.
Thanks a lot, Eli. I want to focus this section on associate technologies. As we've heard today, there were other technologies that we call out in specific chapters. This is a chapter that points out other technologies that we feel very much align with the mission of the AI Commission. My fellow commissioners, Chris Darby and Jason Matheny, and I have crafted recommendations to advance U.S. leadership in these technologies, these 6 that are in front of you. AI is not a single technology, but a collection of tools and techniques that rely on and can be applied to other fields. Recognizing this, Congress included both AI and its associated technologies in the Commission's mandate. The Commission argues that the United States must not pursue leadership in AI as an end unto itself, but as one part of a broader strategy to promote U.S. technology and economic competitiveness in key technologies. China has made it clear that it intends to become a world leader in specific strategic sectors through Made in China 2025 initiative and associated government investments. But the United States has not even identified the technologies which are central to its national competitiveness, let alone prioritize leadership in them. The result is a disparate funding and policy approach to technology protection and promotion across the U.S. government and a lackluster coordination with the private sector. To remedy this problem, the president should issue an executive order designating a list of key technologies in which the U.S. leadership is essential to its overall competitiveness as a part of the national technology strategy proposed in Chapter 9. The Commission also proposes a preliminary list of key technologies and provides specific actions to ensure U.S. leadership in each. I will briefly summarize our recommendations on biotechnology, quantum computing, 5G, robotics, advanced manufacturing, and energy systems. Let's start with biotechnology. AI will enable transformational breakthroughs in the biological sciences that enhance human health and capacity and make the biotechnology sector a major driver to U.S. economic competitiveness. The U.S. government should prioritize the development of an advanced biotechnology manufacturing ecosystem to ensure that the results of these analytical improvements continue to be produced in the United States. Quantum computing. As semiconductor manufacturers reach the physical limits of microchip design, leadership in the next generation computing hardware will be essential to leadership in AI. The US government should publicly announce its priority, and it will prioritize quantum computing use cases to create a market for such services and to incentivize the domestic fabrication of quantum computing components. In 5G, telecommunication networks enable the transfer of data between AI systems, making their security a pressing national security concern. To accelerate 5G deployment while preserving key Department of Defense capabilities, the US government should expand mid-band spectrum sharing between the department and commercial carriers. Robotics. Autonomous systems that rely on robotics are being applied everywhere from advanced manufacturing to warfare. To ensure the United States is a leading producer and adopter of robotics, the US government should incentivize the development of a world-class robotics software platform, a strategically important area aligned with existing US technical strengths. Advanced manufacturing. The ability to manufacture high-tech products domestically is critical to a nation's security and its economic productivity. The US government should specifically expand its 3D printing capabilities by tasking the Department of Defense to identify all legacy components in active weapon systems capable of being produced by 3D printing and do so by 2025. Energy systems. Cheap and reliable access to energy is critical to the US national security. The US government should commit to developing and domestically manufacturing energy storage technologies to meet the US market demand by 2030. I will now open the floor for discussions on these recommendations.
So Gilman, this is Eric. I have a question about the biotech world. It seems obvious to me that the right thing to do is to build essentially the equivalent of a cloud-based system where you could basically order the biological device that you wish, and then it shows up in the equivalent of the mail in a day or two. And that platform could also be built using very powerful AI technologies that would cause the synthesis to be relatively straightforward. Is that the kind of stuff you're talking about, or are you talking about something different?
I think that's a part of the things that we're talking about, right? I mean, look, it's pretty clear that even in the battle and the current pandemic, AI and machine learning was very transformative, right? But we need the whole ecosystem. You know, it's not just the discovery of the appropriate drug or the, breaking down the bug itself, but the entire process of how do you go from that discovery to actually creating the vaccines or the counter bug strategies that you may have, and then to deploy them and get through all the regulatory process in a way that still ensures safety, right? So think of this as end to end. We kind of apply it in these narrow areas with great success, but we're asking for a much broader capacity, a broader strategy applies to biotech. Biotech, it's pretty clear to us, is going to be one of those areas in the kind of fourth industrial revolution that's going to be transformative. It transforms health, it transforms well-being, agriculture, it covers the whole gambit, food production. We need that capability, and we need to build that ecosystem, right? The current ecosystem is designed for a prior way in which we design and develop these systems. We need to have a much more modern approach. I think AI is going to be transformative. We need to compute to be able to do it, and we need to make sure it's widely available and easily accessible. I know, Chris, you may have Chris has been a big advocate on the biotech, and you may have a few things that you want to add on top of what I said, Chris.
Well, I think Eric touches on something that's important. I would look at it from the data side. We don't have a national equivalent to BGI, the Beijing Genomics Institute. And that worries me, because if data is the new oil and bio is the next economic revolution, we are running short there. I think that we're running behind. And so to the extent that we can begin to have a national strategy around the data sets that really underpin bioinnovation. I think that's really important because AI needs the data, and I think that the process pipeline going bug to drug or bug to innovation or data to innovation is really, it starts with data, and we need national strategy around biodata in a big way, and so it's not exactly what you're talking about, Eric, but it's certainly related. I think Jason probably has some thoughts on it as well.
Why don't you, but Chris, since you feel strongly about this, why don't we just write that down? It would be very helpful to have some variant of a biobank that the AI systems could actually use.
It's a great suggestion. Let's go capture that.
And I do feel strongly about it. Thanks, Eric. We will add it.
Good idea.
Gilman, I'd like to use a question from the audience we received yesterday, actually, on the topic of quantum. Question is from Peter McKinnon, who asked, has the potential of quantum-based cyber threats being considered in this or other chapters? Further, what are the implications of quantum breakthroughs in the next 10 years with regard to this initiative?
Well, let's start with the using of quantum computers to break RSA encryption, which is, I think, something that's worrying a lot of folks right now. We're still a ways off. I mean, quantum computers are still very noisy. They have high error rates. While we're stringing more and more qubits together, we've still got a ways to go. Nevertheless, we need to start thinking about encryption systems that are quantum resistant. I know there are a lot of researchers in this area, and in fact, several startups are beginning to work in the quantum resistant area. NIST is looking into this. I think this is important. But I also think quantum has other applications that go well beyond Shor's algorithm. Quantum can transform how we do sensing. And sensing is critical for AI. I mean, without good sensors out in the field, AI would be staring blind. I think the area of applying new kinds of sensors using quantum technologies can be transformative. I also think there's an area around quantum computing systems that may have benefit in the hybrid architecture. Can we take advantage of even noisy quantum systems today to optimize data that's being collected to process it for AI? You kind of think of this as more like a quantum FPGA. I think there's some areas of research that could have a great deal of yield for us. And finally, quantum communications, the ability to move data in a way where you know it can't be tampered with. Again, very critical for AI as you go from sensor to compute to decision, making sure those pathways are secure. So there's lots of areas in quantum applications that go beyond just standard-based compute. Illy, your mic's off.
Thanks, Gilman. There's another good question from Ryan Shad via YouTube. The commission mentioned the United States government has not identified key emerging tech. Does this include recognition of the NSC's October 2020 National Strategy on Critical and Emerging Technologies? And there's another question from Peter McKinnon via YouTube. Why only energy storage? What about energy generation and distribution technologies and know-how, example, SMRs?
I'll do the energy one, but I'll turn over to my other commissioners to give them a chance to, maybe Jason or Chris want to answer the other question. Energy is a big field, and I think all those areas pointed out are reasonable fields as well. But as it applies to many of the national security systems, particularly systems that need to be mobile, autonomous, or out in the field, a key limiting factor is energy storage. I mean, ask any soldier who has to carry around his or her backpack, about 40% of that backpack, the weight is batteries, right? And if you have to make a decision between carrying ammo, carrying armor, or batteries, the last thing you want to do is be trading your protection for energy sources. It's great. You have great night vision, except it goes dark and dumb because you have no power. So this is a real critical issue. And again, also to be able to power those sensors as well as those edge computers out in the edge to make AI happen. Again, I think energy production and energy sources are important, but storage is a real important problem that we got to get solved if we really want to put AI in autonomous systems or in sensors out in the field.
Yeah, I would hate to be in a situation where our adversaries were able to field millions of little robots which could survive for days or weeks when we didn't have that.
Yeah, it's pretty transformative. Jason or Chris, want to take a shot at the prior question?
On the NSC question, I might defer to Chris or Seth or others who might have been following these developments. But my understanding is that what we're waiting for is a document from the Department of Commerce that would define critical and emerging technologies for the purposes of ECRA and export controls. So I don't think that the October report from NSC answers that call that was in the ECRA legislation. But Chris, you might know better than me.
Yeah, so that's right.
No, I do not.
Oh, sorry.
Chris. How about you, Chris McGuire?
No.
Apologies. Of course, defer to the commissioners.
I think
No, Chris,
Darby said he did.
I don't know.
It's up to you now, Chris.
So those are different lists. The ECRA list and the one put out by the White House and the strategy were completely separate and disconnected, especially for regulatory reasons. The list in the strategy did contain an annex that had a list of critical and emerging technologies. There was about 20 technologies in it. It was kind of very high level, but also most importantly in the strategy, there was no implementation plan behind it. There was nothing saying how these technologies are actually important or what we're going to do about them. It just was, generally these are things that we think people should be paying attention to with no detail. There has to be another level beyond that. And that's what we're trying to get in this objective.
So I'd like to see us promote this as hard as we can. As was noted earlier, China has such a strategy and we don't have one. And I'm concerned once again that we're getting a little piece here, a little piece there. The export control people are worried about this. The funding people are worried about this. It'd be useful to try to build a consensus on what the list is. My own opinion of what the list is the list is semiconductors, software, AI, various forms of synthetic bio, various forms of energy, quantum, and maybe a few others. But I think it's most important that the nation have a list because that's the list that should guide government funding and loan guarantees and things like that. If they're that critical, then we should be willing to advance money to get the factories built and so forth. If quantum is that important, then we should be getting the supply chain ready and so forth. We need to build a consensus around this at a national level.
Yeah, I think, Eric, you're absolutely right. It's not just the list, right? It's also laying out the strategy.
So,
China has...
I said it at the beginning. I'll say it as the end because we're coming to the end of these chapters. We have in here a thesis that supports a whole of government response to what we have defined as pillars of the foundation of how we have our country and its founding principles relayed in terms of governance, in terms of economy, in terms of all the different elements to withstand the test of time that our founding fathers stood up. So this is just another element of what a whole of government response requires. If you break down each of the 16 chapters, it discusses this. Each of those elements come out. So again, I think everybody's agreeing on the same elements. They're just in chapters without one entity in charge of, or I don't know if you need that, but at least one whole government response.
Italy, we had some more questions from the web.
Illy, you're on mute.
It has to happen once a day, but it happened twice today. So Gilman, I would like to ask the following 3 questions after we conclude the conversation about these chapters, because these are questions that have arrived during the day, yesterday and today.
Fair enough.
And they're on different chapters. But if there are no other comments on the last chapter, I strongly concur with Katharina. As we discussed yesterday, part 2 of our final report really provides a strong foundation for the technology. Am I still on mute, guys?
No, you're talking. We can hear you.
Okay. But I think part 2 of the final report really provides these pillars for a national technology strategy that Katharina has been talking about, that Chris Darby presented yesterday. So I think all these elements we talked today are really for the executive branch and the legislative branch to start taking action on. And so with that, Gilman, I thank you again for chapter
no problem.
16 and the staff on this. Go ahead. I'm here.
So Ellie,
yes,
Ellie,
sir.
So Ellie, can we just take a minute, if we're done with the chapters, and kind of see if there's any other, before we go to questions from the audience, is everybody basically happy, or are people unhappy? In other words, let's just do a simple test. Are people generally happy with where we are? And I'll say that I am, and I'm very pleased with the level of interaction. This has been phenomenal from my perspective in terms of consensus building. I think we heard Mignon was happy.
Yes. That was Safra. I'm happy. Yeah.
Steve. I apologize, Safra. I didn't see you. Safra was happy. Is Mignon happy?
Mignon is happy.
Okay.
Not on a tropical island, but I'm happy.
Let's go to Jason, Gilman, Steve, Katrina, Andrew.
Very happy.
Andy.
Happy.
Okay.
Happy.
Jose Marie.
Happy.
Okay. Bill, Eric. Bob Work, are you happy?
Collaboration over the last
couple
of years.
Very, very happy. Yeah, I'm very.
Yeah, and Safra, did I cut you off? Did you want to add anything?
No, I was on mute now. No, I think this is an incredible piece of work, and I think we've touched a lot of areas and have come in a reasonable place, not in any extreme, but with enough enthusiasm and drive that this is going to cause a lot of discussion and action, I believe.
Yeah. What about Ken? Did I hear from you?
I think it's
Ken
a
Ford?
good piece of work, and I'm pleased to be associated with it.
Yeah. And Chris Darby, did we hear from you?
Yes, I'm happy, Eric.
Okay. Good. So, Illy, do you want to now? It sounds like everyone's actually as happy as we ever are. So that's great. Illy, do you want to
overlap with Dr. Horvitz? So I think Dr. Horvitz wanted to say something, but you overlapped.
Oh, I'm sorry. Eric Horvitz.
Oh, I just made a comment that, these processes are always fraught with the real world of constraints and communication and getting something done that's acceptable. I think this has been a remarkable collaboration over a couple of years. I think we've done a good job as a team. It's been a great staff, great executive leadership. And I've enjoyed getting to know the colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Horvitz. Eric Schmidt, anything else you want to add before I turn over to the questions?
No. Yeah, I think we should listen to some questions from the audience and make sure we've addressed our public role as well. And again, I want to agree with Eric Horvitz that, and I'll just say, Eric and I agree. All Erics agree at the moment.
Okay, so we have 3 questions that came sort of like after we concluded conversation on the chapters. The first one, maybe Jason Matheny, you can take this one. This is from Kolya. She says, the argument for transatlantic cooperation seems focused on the competition with China. Is there a risk that this competitive focus makes us overlook opportunities for collaboration on shared interests? The second question okay, Jason, go ahead. And I'll...
Oh yeah, do you want to do it in order? Okay, yeah, I would say it's a great question. I think U.S. relationship with China will be one of the most important and challenging policy issues for the next several decades. So that's one, but it's not the only one. And we have a range of other challenges, both to the U.S. and to the world, that we'll have to confront, from climate to pandemic risks to the unintended risks from emerging technologies such as synthetic biology, to how we govern some of these transnational issues like shared commons. So I think there's a reason to be more inclusive in the kinds of organizing principles for alliances. One that I'm really excited about is the upside potential of applying AI for some of our public health issues. And as mentioned, by Gilman, there's opportunities to apply AI in cooperative research programs involving our allies and partners to solve more protein folding problems, so that we can develop drugs and vaccines faster. Apply it to other hard science and engineering problems so that we can innovate faster on important problems that will benefit society. And then there's climate issues where there's enormous enthusiasm already for cooperation. But I do think our allies in Europe do have similar concerns about the rise of authoritarianism. In some cases, it's China. In other cases, it's a more local issue with Russia. So I think that will have to be part of the organizing framework in our alliances. Over.
Thank you so much, Jason. I'll use the next question that came from Jack Paulson via YouTube for Andrew Moore, maybe, or Dr. Horvitz. Jack is asking, what does the Commission feel is lacking from National Science Foundation or Department of Energy supercomputing centers, which have a long history of giving academics access to high computing power systems?
Specifically on these very large neural networks and other sorts of distributed optimization problems, the architecture is around massive parallel use of things like GPUs or other processing units which can do large vector operations. And so the focus there is on these sort of massively replicated big server banks. And there the main issues are around things like cooling and provisioning of huge data centers containing all of those things. The HPC centers have traditionally, that doesn't have to be the same in the future, traditionally focused on other forms of computation where you need lots of intercommunication between all the nodes during the big computations. And so for that reason, lots of workloads are moving on to more boring, if you like, cloud architectures of huge GPU server farms rather than these sort of centralized high performance computers.
And beyond the the architecture, those resources have not been available necessarily as needed. They've been metered through proposal processes, through grants to academia, to NSF, for example. I've just had the experience of being on the executive board and a co-founder of the OSTP HPC initiative that brought together the national labs with industry to support COVID-19 proposals. It's very interesting to see the different resources available and how teams would select different resources based on data set availability, GPU, bandwidth, memory. So it's not clear that today's availability and types of resources are the right ones we need for moving forward.
Yeah, I think the vetting process, as it applies to AI, may be different. You know, when you have an inspiration, a good idea, you want to chase it. You don't want to be filling out, you know, applications and, you know, to get your time on the machine. You need to pursue it. So particularly since AI, the algorithms are generally widely available, maybe the data may not be and the compute may not be. If we can solve this, we can open this up. And it's not just to, you know, the best, you know, PhD programs in the best universities, but if we can open up and leverage, you know, our other capacities, our other centers of excellence, our other research facilities, even the state, you know, second tier state schools, you know, I've seen some really amazing ideas being proposed. They just don't have the access to the compute to prove it out.
But I would question the idea that compute is necessarily the critical resource. You know, just to make an analogy, if you told people that in order for computer science research to go forward, everybody needed supercomputers in the 1980s, you know, clearly you would have been wrong. So I think there's a plausible argument that we need to make computing resources more widespread, but also the nature of the hardware innovation in Moore's law applied to AI hardware is that the cost of accessing AI hardware is growing. So the accessibility of AI hardware, the barriers are decreasing quite rapidly. You know, if you compare to what we can, the random researcher can access now compared to 5 years ago. So that may take care of it as well. But I mean, I think we do want to hedge our bets, right? And increase accessibility.
It's a full range. And, you know, I'm a little biased on the simulation side, right? We need a lot of compute to do a lot of those simulations and to do that reinforcement learning. Now, maybe AI progresses to a point where we have new ways to approach the problem than, you know, using neural nets and other kinds of things. But as of today, compute is a rate limiter for a lot of research.
I do want you guys to understand that confederations of researchers can really help each other. It's not that everyone needs their own personal supercomputer.
Correct.
You can have one big push to create a new language embedding. That's sure, that might be 50 million CPU hours or GPU hours, but then once you've got that embedding, whole new breakthroughs can happen.
Yeah.
So I don't think the answer is like spend half or a quarter of our entire research funding budget on new compute. Cloud can provide a lot of the boring compute, and then for the needs of robotics or potential new things, then we should have federally funded new architectures also being implemented.
Well, also, I would argue if you wasted 25% of your budget on some cutting edge AI hardware, it's obsolete in 2 years anyway.
Hence the problem with computing.
And if suddenly in my whole career, if an AI researcher has come to me asking for AI resources for doing their project, it always turns out to be about 10 times as much as is currently available. And if we give them 1,000 times as much, they will need 10,000 times as much. I promise you that.
Okay, one last question, and it goes for Dr. Griffiths. This is a question from Rob Walker via YouTube. U.S. doesn't hire non-citizens for national security position. So why so much emphasis on recruiting students and workers we can't hire?
Okay, thank you very much. It's a good question. First of all, I should say that if you take the totality of the recommendations through the various reports we've addressed in our other reports a great deal the issue of homegrown talent. So this report is the first time we really looked at non-citizens, and partly we believe it's both. It's not either or. We have equal emphasis on both, but the United States has actually done very well by attracting young people to come to the United States, either for their education or post their education, and stay and do very, very good work here. So we want to have that continue. We don't want to have other countries attract the talent away from the United States. But we should also mention that we were considering not just people for national security positions, but we're also looking at the needs for a larger talent pool available for private companies and universities. And our recommendations recommend increasing the number of green cards for appropriately vetted immigrants that are high skilled in AI or other STEM fields. And so we think it's important to develop the talent pipelines, both internal and external, to allow us to develop the quality and the scope and size of workforce that are going to be needed going forward.
Let's not forget a lot of our national security capabilities built on top of either commercial or generalized discoveries done in science. And if you look at researchers from abroad studying in the United States, they have been a major contributor, not just at the university level, so as they stay and go into our corporations. It's a major competitive advantage. If you ask any one of the other competitors out there, our nation state competitors, they would say that in AI, the US advantage is talent. As we complain a lot about not having enough talent, they would love to have our talent, and they would love to keep the talent that they're losing to the US on their shores. It's a major competitive advantage. You can't afford to lose it.
And I would even further pile on with what Jose Marie was commenting on. I think the Commission is advocating a extremely broad front on all channels. So the chapter on the government workforce talks about, how do we retain, how do we bring people into the government, how do we train our talent that's in the government to be more, AI savvy. And additionally, we want to grow the domestic pipeline. Additionally, we want to grow the foreign pipeline. I don't believe that there's any particular path that we are saying we should not be trying to improve upon.
Yili, you're silent again.
Okay, so what else do we have to do, guys?
Illy, we can't hear you.
Right. There's something else going on because you're showing up.
Yeah, you're.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
So Eric, I have some admin notes that I'd just like to go over with all of you about the next steps, but I'll turn it over to you first and the other commissioners if you have any comments, any guidance for us, any alibis.
Well, look, I think the commissioners as a group just collectively said thank you to you and the staff, and everyone seems enthusiastic. This was a collaborative process. I am personally very, very proud of the quality of the work. I'm very proud of Bob. I'm very proud of Illy. I'm proud of all of the commissioners and all of the staff. So unless there's more self-congratulation, which is always welcome, we can just finish up.
Any other commissioners?
I'll just go ahead and give some more credit where credit is due. I would like to thank our chairman and co-chair. They have been incredible leaders. Whatever preconceived notions I had, which were great, you've eclipsed and surpassed those. So I just want to thank you for really setting the tone. And I think, I know that the product that we're delivering is reflective of that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mignon.
Hoorah.
Thank you, Mignon.
Yeah, and I also wanted to say a number of commissioners worked really hard leading these teams. I won't name you, but you know who you are. And I somehow it worked out really, really well. So Illy, why don't we go ahead and finish up?
Thank you, Eric. So just quickly, next steps, we will update the draft that was posted online based on the last 2 days' comments and guidance from all of you. Based on your feedback, we will start drafting the implementation plans that you will review in a plenary in February. And then we will package both documents for a final plenary meeting on March 1st. And after that, we will submit our final report to Congress and the executive branch. So those were like the next steps we have. I would like to thank the audience for the last 2 days. I know these were like 4 long hours each day. And today I understand there was a internet outage in the Northeast United States that hit Google and some other providers, including Zoom, but I don't think we were impacted by that, so that's good. But again, if you want to send comments, questions, feedback to all of us, please use our website. There's a link there where you can submit your concerns, your questions, anything else. We have really depended on a lot of you for the last almost 2 years to bring this document to where it is right now. So we will continue this communication. And again, thank you so much. I want to thank the commissioners. Thank you so much for always being available and taking time from your busy schedules to dedicate 2 days to go over, line by line of these chapters. Lastly, I want to thank the team. We have a really good team. this is not possible without a really good team here in Crystal City, or any people are working from around the country to make this possible. And I thank you all. Over to you, Eric and Bob Work, for closing remarks.
Well, to me, what's interesting is we managed to get to this point essentially during a horrific pandemic. And we managed to actually build a consensus, work together using all the distance tools that we had. I look forward to us all meeting in person at some point in the future. But between now and March 1, let's stay busy in the way we have been. I would like to see, Illy, a marketing plan. That is basically, how are we going to, once you publish the report, what else do the commissioners need to do in order to make sure that it really has an impact? You're an expert on this. You don't have to answer that right now, but let's plan to discuss that at some future public meeting.
We'll do so. And Mr. Work, before I turn it over to Angela to close the meeting.
Sorry, I had a phone call, didn't want to disturb everybody. I have nothing more to say. I think it's all been said. This afternoon, since I didn't have a speaking part, I just kind of unplugged and listened to the entire conversation. And I think anybody who is watching this can get a sense for the deep expertise that we have on the commission. And we're not afraid to come at every single subject from a lot of different ways. So, I don't have anything more to say other than great job to everyone.
Thank you, sir. And with that, I'll turn it over to Angela to formally close the meeting.
Thank you, Illy. On behalf of NSCAI, thank you for attending the Commission's second day of our virtual meeting to discuss the draft final report. This meeting stands adjourned.